Hi, and thanks for joining us for our webinar on making your 2018 Farm Bill decisions here in early 2020. Joining me on the webinar today are my colleague, Michael Langemeier, who's the Associate Director of the Purdue Center for Commercial Agriculture, and Kaitlin Myers, who's the State Program Specialist for the Indiana Farm Service Agency. I'm Jim Mintert, Director of the Center for Commercial Agriculture. We're going to spend the next hour or so talking about some of the details that you're going to be faced with respect to this bill and the sign-up procedure, which you need to get underway here pretty soon because the deadline is March 15. So before we get started, though, if you want to pose some questions during the course of the webinar, the technology we're going to use today is a website called slido.com. Just go to slido.com and you'll see a box there asking you to enter the meeting number. That meeting number is E18 and with a pound sign in front of it. And from that point forward, you should be able to just type in your questions. And I've got a laptop here. I'll be monitoring the questions during the course of the webinar, and we'll try and respond on air. If we run out of time, we'll try and respond to you by way of email or posting later on our website on the Purdue Center for Commercial Agriculture. But we'll try and address most of those questions during the course of the broadcast. So let's just have a little bit of a review, and we're going to go back to the 2014 bill and maybe highlight some differences between the 2014 bill and the decision you made then and what's taken place with respect to the 2018 bill that you've got to make a decision on here soon. So if you go back to the 2014 bill, most farmers chose the Ark County program for both corn and soybeans. On the wheat, PLC was more competitive, but most people for corn and soybeans chose Ark County. And the forecast at that time when you were signing up was for higher Ark County than PLC payments over the 5-year life of the bill. And it was a relatively straightforward decision once we did some analysis. And so the forecast was really pretty much on target for that 2014 bill. The payments were largely front-loaded with respect to Ark County, the bigger payments coming in the early years and smaller payments in the later years. So the question was, is it going to be the same kind of decision here under the 2018 bill? And if you go back and look at the details, the forecasts for that 2014 bill were really keyed off the fact that the benchmark revenues in 14, 15, and 16 were going to be high, and it was clear they were going to be high at the time you were signing up. And that those high benchmark revenues really did front-load the Ark County payments and made it an easy choice. The situation this time is different. And so I think the bottom line, and the reason we wanted to start off this way, is to highlight the idea that for most of you, you don't want to do exactly what you did under the 2014 bill. You do need to do some additional analysis and think about what you want to do. And this time around, the PLC program is much more competitive, deserves a lot more consideration, and in fact, for many of you, might actually wind up being the best choice. However, there's a program that was available last time that we didn't spend much time on because it wasn't very competitive and very interesting for most of you. And that's the Ark Individual Coverage Program. And so for folks in the Eastern Corn Belt, especially this year, the Ark Individual Coverage Program could fit in some situations. And we'll spend some time talking about that and maybe highlight the situations where we think that might be most applicable. So Kaitlin, let's talk a little bit about the sign-up process, because I know folks at FSA are a little bit worried about this. Very few people have signed up so far.
Right. So the sign-up process consists of 3 tasks, one being the PLC Yield update, and the deadline to complete the Yield update is September 30th. Next would be the election choice, and we have the 3 programs that were reauthorized under the 18 Farm Bill: PLC, Ark County, and Ark Individual. And the election and enrollment have the same deadline of March 15th for 2019. Once the staff knows your election choice and that has been completed, then enrollment takes place.
So enrollment is just kind of the final piece of paperwork, effectively, once you've made your decision, correct?
Right. So enrollment is completed once we have your signature on that contract.
Okay. So let's talk a little bit about the PLC yield update process, because that can be an important consideration and maybe is not quite as straightforward as some of us thought initially. I think initially some of us thought you would just automatically do the yield updates. That's not always the case. Let's maybe walk us through the procedure a little bit here.
Sure. The landowner has a one-time decision to update the farm's PLC yield, and this is effective for 2020. And the update can be done on a crop-by-crop basis. The operator or the landowner can initiate this process, but the landowner is the one that signs the form. The update is effective for 2020 through the life of the Farm Bill, so through 2023. And just to make a note, it is not retroactive back to 2019. So what you had under the previous Farm Bill is your PLC yield in 2019. How we're calculating the update is a little different. This time, we're taking a simple average of the years when the crop was planted from 2013 through 2017 times 90% times a national ratio. And the national ratio is what is new under the 2018 Farm Bill. For corn and soybeans, the national ratio, we're taking an additional 90%, and for wheat, that ratio is 95.45%.
So just to do the math real quick, what that really means is you take your average yields from 2013 to 17 and multiply it by 0.81 is what really happens, right? Because you're doing 0.9 twice.
Yes.
And that's the reason why the PLC update is not an automatic, because that's a pretty severe reduction relative to your actual. And I think early on, I know, Michael, you and I talked about this a couple times last fall. Historically, if you have a chance to update yields, you just do it.
Yeah.
We would still recommend you definitely need to make the comparison, but I think for many people in Indiana, in some cases you're going to update yields on individual farms, in some cases you're not, once you do the math. And the reason is because of that 0.81 factor.
Makes a lot of difference.
Yeah.
81% times those 13 to 17 yields really brings that number down. And it may not be higher than the old PLC yield.
Yeah, and I think one of the things you and I talked about earlier was, particularly in Indiana in 2015, a lot of people didn't have very good corn yields, and that's going to be included in these computations. But the answer is, you won't know until you do the calculations. And so we would encourage people to do it on every single farm and crunch through the numbers. It's not that hard. We're going to show you a tool at the end that will help you make that decision a little bit. So just keep that in mind. So, and the other key point that you made, Kaitlin, was the fact that at the end of the day, the owner is the one that decides or has to make their signature on the form, right?
Right. And this slide just shows what form we're going to use to complete the yield update. It's a CCC 867 form. And like I mentioned, the operator can initiate this process and fill out the yield data on that form, but the landowner will sign this form completing the yield update. And if there's a farm that has multiple owners, we are only requiring at least one owner to sign that form.
Okay. So this kind of highlighting what we just said, and that is that updating the yields is not an automatic decision as it has been maybe sometimes in the past. I think a lot of us are thinking about the fact that, you know, as time goes on, our yields have been going up, therefore we want to update. But that conversion factor, the 90% times 90%, really does pull things down. In the case of wheat, it might be a little more competitive, although as you indicated, it's based on a national ratio. So it was designed to make it comparable to what's going on in corn and soybeans. But the bottom line is you need to do some comparisons. And, you know, we've talked to some folks that have done the comparisons. I was talking to somebody, I think last week, it wound up that they updated about 10% of the farms that they were working with. So it's going to be an individual situation.
And with the tool, it's really simple to do this. I mean, you just do it by crop, by FSA farm, and see which is higher, the old yield or the new yield.
All right, so let's talk about the program choices, and that's obviously Ark County, which we were familiar with from last time. The Price Loss Coverage Program, which again we were familiar with from last time, at least I think most of us were. The one that's probably we spent less time on in the under 2014 bill was the Individual Coverage Ark program, and that's we'll spend more time on that today. Given the fact that people in 2019 had some significant yield losses here in the Eastern Corn Belt, significant, in some cases, prevented plantings, that program is potentially, and I want to emphasize the word potentially, attractive in some situations. So it's worth taking a look at for some folks, and we'll talk about that in a little more detail. So that Ark County and PLC choice is made for each crop and on each FSA farm. And the Ark IC choice is a little different, maybe I should say a lot different. It's made by SFA farm number, but it's for all covered crops simultaneously. And then we'll talk more about this later, but it's also goes across farms for all the farms that you would enroll in the individual coverage program within the state, correct?
Correct.
And that makes the choice a little more challenging if you're looking at making it on multiple farms. And again, that's going to be a situation where you have to do the computations to make a decision.
There's a lot of choices here. If you look at the Ark County and PLC, each crop and each FSA farm, we know that some people have a lot of FSA farms, but when we look at the calculations, at least the calculations that we've done, you probably aren't going to make that much different of a choice by FSA farm by crop. And so, for example, if you choose one program for corn, you're probably going to consistently choose that program across FSA farms, and the same for soybeans. And so it's not quite as complicated as it might seem at first glance at this slide.
Yeah. And the one where that gets a little more complicated is if you had a situation where ARC IC
yes, that definitely
is potentially attractive, and that is a little more complicated.
But it is tougher than last time, as you indicated earlier, Jim. Last time you had corn and soybeans, Ark County.
Yeah.
It's pretty simple.
Yeah, so we'll talk more about those details later. Walk us through some of these details, Kaitlin.
So, who actually makes the election on the farm? That would be the person who has interest in the cropland on that farm. So landowners who cash rent do not make that election. The operator would, since they're 100% on that farm. The election deadline is March 15th of 2020. And one thing to note here is that the election for 2019 is also the election for 2020. So it's locked in for 2 years.
And that's different from last time. Last time you were locked in for the life of the bill.
Right. So new for this farm bill, starting in 2021, producers have the opportunity to change their election on the farm every year after that. So they have that option in 21, 22, and 23. Another important thing to note here is that the election and enrollment must be completed by March 15th. Otherwise, that farm will receive a default election. And the default election is the current election on the farm from the 14th Farm Bill. And when that default election is made, no payments will be issued on that farm for 2019. So those are kind of the ramifications of not meeting that deadline.
And your last point, I guess we want to reiterate, we've said it several times, but we're going to keep saying it, the deadline is March 15. And the reason we're emphasizing that is we know that very few people in the Eastern Corn Belt have completed their applications or even truthfully started the application process. We talked to you, I think, the other day, and I think the estimate was only maybe 6% of the farms in Indiana had signed up as of the end of last week.
Yes. And there's only about 41 working days left to see the majority of our producers through our office. So it's really important to make your appointment early, get that paperwork done, and if a producer makes an election now and changes their mind later, they can always change their election up until that deadline.
Yeah, so our last point on that slide is make your appointment now. So maybe make that number one on your to-do list. You don't have to make your decision when you make the appointment, obviously, but you need to get that appointment, get yourself lined up at your local FSA office sooner rather than later. So let's talk about the elements of the decision, Michael. We've got Ark County and PLC. Let's talk about that a little bit.
These are similar to last time. Ark County is based on county yields. However, this time the yields are trend adjusted, so that is a difference from the 2014 Farm Bill. And as last time, it's based on the marketing year average U.S. price or the effective price, whichever is higher. The effective price is the PLC price. So for corn, that would be $3.70. So it's $3.70 or the marketing year average price. If the marketing year average price is higher, similar for soybeans, the effective price or reference price for soybeans is $8.40. The PLC actual revenue is based primarily off price. If price drops below $3.70 for corn and $8.40 for soybeans, for example, it triggers a payment. The payment is calculated based on these PLC yields, and so that's why it's so important to determine whether those yields need to be updated or not.
And I think, as Kaitlin indicated, just remember that if you do go the PLC route for 2019, you'd still be using the old yields, right?
Right.
Yeah. So let's just kind of walk through this in Ark County. So you've got your initial decision for 2019 and 2020, as Kaitlin was saying, by crop and FSA farm. The payments would occur if actual crop revenue is below the revenue guarantee or the benchmark. That benchmark is actually I want to say that again. The Ark County guarantee is 86% of the benchmark. The coverage is capped at 10% of the benchmark revenue. And there's some situations, particularly in the Ark IC program, where people could be hitting that cap.
Definitely.
And then the benchmark revenue is based on the Olympic average, which means drop the high and the low of trend-adjusted yields over that 2013-2017 time frame, times the Olympic average of the higher of the marketing year average crop price for the preceding 5 crop years, or as you indicated, Michael, you would, if that marketing year average drops below those reference prices, in this case it'd be $370 for corn, $840 for soybeans, or $550 for wheat, you wind up substituting those reference prices for the marketing year average. And then finally, the payment is made on 85% of the base acres. And that's an important point to remember. Later on, we talk about the individual coverage program. The payment's made on a different percentage. We won't talk about that at this moment.
And the by-crop and FSA farm, as we indicated earlier, that's also different, looking at Ark County versus Ark individual. So that's why we have those in bold.
Yeah, all right. So, Kaitlin, some details to be aware of under the 2018 bill that we didn't have to deal with or weren't thinking about in 2014.
Yeah, another new thing under the 18 Farm Bill is now for Ark County payments, the benchmark revenue and guarantees are based on physical location. Under the 14 Farm Bill, we base this off of administrative county, which is where the records are held, and that's not always where the farm physically lies. So now we're calculating those payments based on physical location versus administrative county.
And I think for some of us that's viewed as kind of like a correction because it created some challenges last time and a situation I think some people viewed as being inequitable. Because in that situation under the 14 bill, sometimes you had a bill and farms perhaps side by side in a given county that might be getting different payments based on the fact that one was based on a different administrative location. So I guess for a lot of us it's kind of a correction in this particular bill relative to what was in the 2014 bill.
Another thing that is new is our cascade for how we are determining Ark County yields. Under the 14 Farm Bill, we used Nass yield data as our primary source, and under this Farm Bill, we're looking at RMA data first, then Nass. In situations where neither RMA or Nass data is available to establish those Ark County yields, the state committee will use the best available data to establish those yields.
And I'm going to stick my neck out here and say in Indiana that means we're going to be using RMA yields probably in virtually every county, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah. And probably
most likely. And
probably that statement is also true just about I won't say every county, but in the vast majority of counties in the Eastern Corn Belt, right? So that's, I think from a lot of us, that might be, I don't know if I want to say improvement, but the challenge is the Nass data is based on a survey. The RMA data is based on the actual records that you had to turn into your crop insurance agent.
And in the next slide, Kaitlin's going to talk about the fact that now there's a lot more counties that do the irrigated, non-irrigated. That's partially as a result of the of access to the RMA yield data. I do want to point out, Kaitlin, and maybe you're getting to it, but the benchmark yields are lagged 1 year. That is different from the 14 Farm Bill. For example, if we were still under the 14 Farm Bill, 2019 would have used 14 through 18 yields.
Right.
Now, with this new Farm Bill, it's lagged 1 year, and that does change the calculations.
Yeah, so with the lag year for 2019, those benchmark years are 2013 through 2017.
All right, let's take a look at the map because Michael was highlighting the change. Just walk us through what's going on here, Kaitlin.
So under the last Farm Bill, the 2014 Farm Bill, we only had 4 counties in Indiana that were designated irrigated and non-irrigated. So like Michael mentioned, because of the RMA data that's available that we are using, we now have more Indiana counties that are designated irrigated and non-irrigated, and you can see from the map all of those that are designated are shaded. So now we have 43 counties that are designated, and this only comes into play if the crop is enrolled in Ark County.
And I think, although we didn't show maps for the other states, the same kind of change has occurred in most other states because of the switch to RMA data. So for example, Illinois, Ohio, et cetera, a lot more counties have irrigated and non-irrigated yields big change relative to 2014. And you can kind of tell looking at the map, those counties that have some red on them are the counties where you had irrigated yields available at least for one crop in 2014. There was only 4 counties in that category under the 2014 bill, and now we're at 43. Right. So almost half the state now has at least one crop with an irrigated yield, and a big change there going forward. The PLC program, a lot of the details here really haven't changed in terms of how it's computed relative to the 2014 bill. So you're making your decision for 2019 and 2020. Keep in mind, if you choose PLC, the yields are going to be the old PLC yields, even if you choose to update yields. Going for 2020 forward, you'd be using the new yields, but not for 2019. Those reference prices are the same, $370 for corn, $840 for soybeans, and $550 for wheat. Payment made at 85% of the base acres. That's the same percentage we were using under the Ark County program. And then the maximum PLC rates are really just the difference between those reference prices and the loan prices. And it turns out that then the max, which we wouldn't expect to be hitting on these, but the max would be $1.50 per bushel on corn, $2.20 on soybeans, and $2.12 on wheat. Our forecasts do not suggest those maximum payments are likely, but that is in the bill.
There is also a mechanism for those reference prices to increase. However, looking at projected corn, soybean, and wheat prices, that's not likely to occur. And so these reference prices are probably going to be the reference prices throughout the life of this farm bill.
That'd be our expectation anyway.
If you choose PLC, just like in the 2014 Farm Bill, you can purchase the supplemental coverage option. We didn't cover that near as much when we talked about the 2014 Farm Bill, because we were primarily talking about corn and soybeans, and Ark County was the natural choice back in 2014. Now that PLC is much more important to look at, particularly for corn, this option is something you need to think about it. It is an option. You don't have to purchase SCO. There is a pretty high subsidy rate for SCO, and so that's what may make this premium attractive to some people. The subsidy rate is 65%. I'd say, well, the subsidy rate in crop insurance is pretty high, but the subsidy rate is not that high for 80% coverage, revenue protection, and 85% revenue protection. So one of the places this might come in is someone might say, well, I'll do 75% revenue protection and then use SCO to get my protection up to 86%. Sounds attractive, right? However, and this is a big caveat, the SCO is based on county yields, not farm yields. And so if you decided to do that, use 75% revenue protection, that product, that crop insurance would be based on your yields. The SCO would be based on county yields, and so you're mixing. It's mixed coverage. And so that makes this less attractive than it would be otherwise.
And the reason we're emphasizing that is whenever we've looked at the county level products, it always seems to make the most sense to take the highest possible coverage that you can get, because you're insuring against that county average. And it's difficult to pull down county averages hard enough to trigger payments unless that revenue guarantee is based on a pretty high percentage. So that's one reason we're kind of maybe throwing, I wouldn't say cold water, but maybe lukewarm water on this option. Yeah. But I think for people, as you point out, I mean, when we look at it, if you're in that category where you've been carrying maybe 75% coverage or perhaps even less, it might be an attractive option, and you wouldn't know until you price the product with your crop insurance agent, because it's going to change as you move across counties.
And for example, in southern Indiana, there's people that have 75% revenue protection coverage down there. Might consider buying SCO to bring that coverage up to 86%. Southern Illinois would be the same way. I'm going to assume Kentucky would be like that too. But that's just something you have to look at in the trade-off. One thing I would not do. I would not necessarily recommend, if you have 85% coverage now, to drop that to 75% and buy SCO. I think that is probably not prudent.
And the reason we're saying that is your likelihood of collecting would drop significantly.
And it's mixed coverage. That whole idea of mixed coverage really complicates things.
So. But the bottom line is, for some people, it's worth taking a look at, and you wouldn't know until you talk to your crop insurance agent and actually get a premium estimate. So let's just kind of highlight the big differences between Ark and PLC, Michael.
So our county, as the 2014 Farm Bill, is based on this benchmark revenue and benchmark guarantee. Payments are capped at 10% of benchmark revenue. That doesn't look to be near as important as it was in the 14 Farm Bill. 2015, for example, a lot of counties in Indiana collected the maximum corn, and quite a few collected the maximum soybean based on those caps. Looking at price projections, right now it doesn't look like that this cap is going to be effective, but that's the way it works. PLC is designed to cover low prices, and so if price on corn drops below $3.70, this provides a pretty good safety net for that. Unfortunately, the soybean price, effective price, is $8.40. That's pretty low soybeans, not probably as good a safety net for soybeans as corn. And so that's leading us into some divergence on what we may recommend for corn and soybeans.
Yeah, so the bottom line is last time we recommended Ark County for most people for both corn and soybeans. This time around we think the PLC program is much more competitive on the corn side, not very competitive on the soybean side.
And it's particularly competitive for wheat. That's not the focus of our webinar today, but certainly for wheat, PLC looks like very competitive product.
And last time that was the
place.
That
was true last
That was
time
the
too.
place where PLC was competitive last time was on wheat. So, all right, you've looked at some historical payments or estimated payments for an example farm. You might describe that farm just a little bit, Michael.
Yes, this is a White County example farm with 3,000 acres, evenly split between corn and soybeans, and so that's what I'm using county average yields to do these estimates, and so that's very important to realize. But that's not going to affect the Ark County computations. This is county yields. But there's a lot on this slide, so let me walk you through this. First of all, in 2019, I'm assuming a $3.80 corn price, and so I'm just making that assumption and looking at possible 2020 prices. The January WASDE report had a U.S. price for corn that was $3.85, and so very similar to that. If we look at the blue and gray bars, I don't see any. And so with $3.80, $3.85 corn, you're not going to trigger an Ark County or a PLC payment for this particular county. That's true of a lot of counties that I've looked at. The 2019 payments, as long as corn price stays above $3.70, are expected to be zero or close to that. In 2020, if you, even with relatively low 2020 price, $3.40 is getting down there. But if we plant 95 million plus acres of corn, it could possibly be that low. It doesn't trigger a very big payment, even with a low corn price, the Ark County, a very small payment, whereas PLC, because the price dropped below $3.70, is triggering a $40 payment, getting to a little bit more, closer to what we're currently expecting. The $3.60 corn would trigger a PLC payment because the price is below $3.70, but no Ark County payment. And so PLC looks like a pretty good option in this particular case, and that's true for a lot of counties in Indiana. I encourage people to use the tool that we're going to be referencing later in this webinar to look at this for your farm. But a lot of the calculations I've done, PLC looks pretty attractive, compared to Ark County, particularly for 2020.
Yeah. So just to highlight that a little bit, the actual numbers when you do the tool computations for an individual county here in Eastern Corn Belt, those numbers are going to vary from what you're showing on the slide, but the trend, as we've looked at across a number of different counties, is very similar.
And I encourage you to use the different 2020 corn prices like I've shown here. If you look at different estimates of 2020 corn prices, they are this wide, because it really depends on the relative plantings of corn and soybeans and trade issues and many other things. And so use a wide range of prices there to evaluate this Ark County PLC choice.
And I think to reiterate, the other key point is a little different than the 2014 bill. In the initial year, likely zero payment for 2019. The payments that we're picking up or projecting are actually for the second year, 2020.
Yes.
Okay. All right, let's look at soybeans because it's a different picture on soybeans.
Soybeans is definitely a different critter here. The Ark County looks like there's going to be payments in this particular case, and for a lot of the counties I've looked at, there's a possibility of payments for Ark County. The soybean trigger or reference price is $8.40, and so unless soybeans get really low, and we're not expecting them to get that low, that's getting below even even a lot of people's estimates of the range in soybean prices. But if soybean prices got to $8, for example, you would trigger some PLC payments both in 2020, but that's not very likely, and so as you were indicating, Jim, Ark County looks pretty good here compared to PLC.
Even when you project a higher PLC payment versus
Yes.
Ark County, the difference is very small, almost a toss-up, right?
Yeah, and in some of the counties, this does vary by county quite a bit. In some of the counties I've looked at, the Ark County payment is smaller. However, in some of the counties I've looked at, the Ark County payment's $30 or more. But always in those cases, Ark County looked very good compared to PLC for soybeans because of that very low effective price.
So this kind of highlights our discussion relative to last time. Last time we recommended people look very hard at Ark County for both corn and beans. This time it looks like PLC is maybe the first choice for corn, and at least think about comparing that as your first choice, and on soybeans starting off with Ark County. So difference compared to the 2014
Yes.
bill. All right, we've alluded to this, but it's time to maybe cover some details about the individual coverage program, the ARC individual. So again, you're making the decision for 2019 and 2020. The payments occur when the FSA farm crop revenue falls below the ARC IC revenue guarantee for an individual crop year. That guarantee is 86% of the benchmark. The coverage is capped at 10% of the benchmark. Those details are similar to the Ark County program. But the difference is you're doing it off of yields from your farms. And so those revenues are calculated using the higher the marketing year average crop prices or the effective price as we described earlier with the Ark County program. But you're using your proven yields. That's a big difference. And then the payment, and we mentioned this earlier, but the payment is made on 65% of the base acres instead of the 85. So in the Ark County, payment made on 85% of base acres. Ark individual, 65% of the base acres. That pulls back the attractiveness of the Ark IC program relative to the Ark County program. However, given what took place in 2019 in the Eastern Corn Belt, that isn't enough to make it unattractive for everybody. So I think that's maybe the key point.
And then the fact that it's by FSA farm, not FSA farm and crop, also reduces the attractiveness because you have to evaluate, if you have both corn and soybeans, you have to evaluate both of those and see whether it pays to enroll both of those in the Ark IC.
Yeah, but the big difference last time was the 65% was the killer.
Yes.
It made the program unattractive.
Yeah.
And that's still true this year, but it's because of what took place with prevented planting and yield reductions in 2019, there's some situations in Indiana and the Eastern Corn Belt where it's still attractive, okay? Let's see. Kaitlin, do you want to walk through the program factors for Ark IC?
Yeah, so for Ark IC, only enrolled farms are included in revenue calculations. The payments are dependent on planting a covered commodity on the enrolled farm. And different from the Ark County program, under Ark Individual, we do require yield reports because we are using those individual yields from that particular farm to calculate the benchmark revenues and guarantees. So the benchmark revenues, guarantees, and actual revenues and payment rates are calculated at the farm level and weighted by the producer's share of the covered commodities planted on all farms enrolled in Ark IC within the state.
Yeah, and that was a detail that we had to actually confirm, this bit about the state. At least Michael and I weren't quite sure about that. We initially thought it was just farms within a county, but it's actually, for those of you that are farming across multiple counties, you have to look at all the Ark IC potentially enrolled farms in the state. And that again makes it a little less, makes the computations more complicated, and it makes it probably a little less attractive for those of you that are thinking about this. So who should consider Ark IC and when should you consider it? Our analysis would suggest that if you have an FSA farm with a 20% production loss in 2019, and that could be from prevented planting, reduced yields, or the combination of both, then it's worth taking a look at. We're not ready to say you should do it, but we are saying it's probably worth taking a look at. If those losses get bigger than 20%, and Michael, you and I looked at some 25 and 30% situations, at that point it starts looking attractive.
Yeah, quite attractive, and really once you get about 25 to 30%, you start getting the maximum payment. The maximum possible payment. You don't have to get to the 50, 60%. Even get to 25 to 30% lower yields. Combining that preventive planning with the relatively low yields you might have had on your planted acres. Once you get to 25 to 30%, you approach that cap.
It gets tricky though, because if you're considering multiple FSA farms, then you've got to look at this averaging of the benchmark revenues across farms, and so that's a little more complicated. But when you look at it on an individual farm basis, we're pretty comfortable saying losses greater than 20% start to make the program look attractive. But when you start combining farms, that starts to get a little more complicated.
And I suggest that people don't try to make this overcomplicated, even though the actual computations are very complicated. Look at this one farm at a time. And I think by doing that, you're going to be able to tell which farms look like they're going to have a pretty sizable payment. And if one particular farm looks like it's at the cap, looks like a potential for a pretty good payment, that one maybe is ARC IC. If one looks like that maybe had a 15% reduction or something like that, and the ARC individual payment looks like there might be one, but it's relatively small. It's well below the cap for the cap, ARC IC cap. Don't enroll that one. And so, try to keep this as simple as possible. Look at it farm by farm, and just try to pick the ones that had major losses, and think about enrolling those in ARC individual.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point, Michael. I mean, we don't really envision a situation. It certainly would be quite rare for somebody to enroll all their farms in ARC IC. No. It's going to be more a question of, do I have one or two or three, or perhaps a smaller number of farms where it might fit, and so that's going to be the situation.
But in East Central Indiana and Northwest Ohio, there could be quite a few farms for a particular operator in the ARC IC. But looking at them one at a time, and then deciding, picking the ones, picking ARC IC for the ones that have major losses. I think that's a prudent way to think about this.
Yeah. So it's probably going to be regional. I mean, there's going to be some counties where I think there's going to be a significant amount of interest in this, and there's going to be some counties where it won't even rise to the top at all. Let's kind of summarize a little bit. So start off, compare your updated yields to existing program yields for each crop and FSA farm. Update the ones that have higher updated yields. And in some cases, those updated yields might be higher, but not by a lot. But there's going to be some situations where it might be significant. On the program choice side, for corn and wheat, we think starting with the PLC program is your initial choice, and then think about whether or not for some reason ARC County might be a better fit for you in that particular situation. On the soybean side, we think most of you are going to want to start with ARC County as your initial program choice, and then think about whether or not for some reason you might want to choose PLC on a particular farm for a particular reason. And then for those of you that had a significant production loss, and there's a lot of people in that category in the Eastern Corn Belt, of 20% or more in 2019, you probably want to at least evaluate ARC IC. And I guess we should add a little additional commentary there. What's going to take place, on at least what we anticipate taking place there for those of you that choose ARC IC, is that you would generate a significant payment under the ARC IC program for the 2019 crop year. But if we have anything remotely close to normal weather and normal production patterns in 2020, probably not collect anything in 2020. But the payments in those situations, when we were doing our calculations, were potentially large enough for 2019. When you take that and average it across the 2-year life of your decision, it, in some cases, looked better than either ARC County or the PLC program. So keep in mind that's what's going on there. You're looking and considering the value of a potentially large payment under ARC IC for 2019, combined with a potential zero payment in 2020. under ARC-IC. And so you want to look at that on a 2-year basis. You can look at it as a total number, or you can think of it as an average number across those 2 years when you're making that comparison. And
just remember the example farm we were looking at here, unless prices get below $8.40 for soybeans and below $3.70 for corn, the ARC County and PLC payments are really small. And right now, with the futures prices we're looking at for 2020, we may not get any payments, for 2020 for those. And so that's why we're focusing more on ARC individual than we did in the previous Farm Bill. Another point I wanted to make here, Jim, is we didn't talk too much about choices being different between irrigated and non-irrigated, and that's because I don't think they're going to be. I think a lot of these payments for ARC County and PLC are really going to be driven by price. If we have anything close to trend yields, price is going to be the huge determinant here of whether we get prices. Price is price. It's not any different if you have an irrigated corn or non-irrigated corn. And so I think if you have both of those in north central Indiana, I think PLC is probably a good choice for both non-irrigated and irrigated corn. So I did want to mention that.
Yeah, good point. All right, some details on the enrollment process, Kaitlin. You want to walk us through the details again?
Yeah, I just want to reiterate a few things on this slide. So the election and enrollment happen at the same time, which is why you see the election and enrollment deadline is the same. So for 2019, March 15th, again, is the deadline to make your election and enroll. For 2020, the enrollment deadline is June 30th. And again, when you make your election in 2019, it is effective for 2020. So that's why we only have an enrollment deadline versus an election deadline for the 2020 program year. Your PLC yield update must be completed by September 30th. And for the election and enrollment, these are completed on the same form. For PLC in ARC County, we're using the CCC 866 form. And if you are enrolling in ARC-IC or ARC Individual, that's done on the CCC 862 form. Okay.
And so as you think about it, I think the owner's signature thing was something we mentioned earlier. So reiterate what's going on with owners versus operators.
Sure. So zero share owner signatures are not required on the contracts. So if you cash rent, your operator at 100% is the only one required to sign that contract for the year.
Okay, and then just a little recap on ARC and PLC.
So for 2019 through 2023 payments, we always issue payments behind after the marketing year average prices are determined, and that's you'll see payments typically after October 1st of the subsequent year. Another requirement under the ARC PLC program is to report all cropland acres for that farm. If all cropland acres are not reported, that farm is ineligible for ARC PLC payments. So that's really important to report your acres on your ARC PLC farms, and that's by using the FSA 578 form. And again, just a reminder, if your farm is enrolled in ARC-IC, we are requiring those production reports or yield reports in order to establish that farm's benchmark revenue and actual revenue calculations.
And just maybe to back up, I think we forgot to mention this earlier, but if you're interested in the ARC-IC program, we talked about having to turn in your actual yields. For most people, what that means is you can turn in your crop insurance yields, right? Your RMA records, basically. Now, there's some people that might not be enrolled in crop insurance that'd be interested in that'd be a little different situation. But for most of the folks watching, it's probably a crop insurance yield record. So, Michael, we've alluded to the tool. Our friends at FarmDoc over at the University of Illinois have developed a Microsoft Excel spreadsheet that we find pretty attractive in terms of doing computations. And we've got a couple of screenshots here of that tool. And that tool is available both from the Illinois FarmDoc site as well as our website. So walk us through this a little bit.
Yeah. You want to check for questions there while
I
I'm
will,
doing that?
yeah.
Okay. Let me walk you through here a little bit. Everything in yellow is stuff that you have to input, but obviously there's not a lot of stuff to input here. Pick the state, pick the county. There's usually several crops for each county, so you need to toggle on that. And then, as Kaitlin was indicated, 43 counties in Indiana have non-irrigated to irrigated, and so you'd want to choose that. And then your PLC yield. Enter the PLC yield. The county yield for 2018 is usually populated when you open the spreadsheet. You do need to estimate yields in 19 and 20 for the county. In this particular case, because it's for White County, I was expecting the 19 yield to be lower than the 18 yield, but that's still uncertain. So that's an estimate, something I would want to check the sensitivity of the computations to that yield. And so I put in the yields for 19 and 20, and then I put in the marketing year average price, just like I did in that example. I've got 385 here, the WASD price, and then I was looking at 360 for 2020, a relatively low price for 2020, and putting that information in, it generates PLC and Ark County payments for 19 and 20, just like is indicated on the screen here. One of the nice things about this tool is if you go to the far right, it also presents the guarantee and the county revenue, and so you can see for 19 that there was no payment, no Ark County payment. By looking at that guarantee and county revenue, you can see that you're not even close to getting a payment. The county revenue is substantially above the guarantee, and so unless price really tumbles here in the next few months, which is unlikely to do, or you had much lower yield than the county has much lower yield than what I'm putting in here, no Ark County payment for 2019. The same for 2020. There's still a pretty wide difference there between county revenue and the guarantee, and so again, unless price is much lower or yield is much lower in 2020, you're not going to generate an Ark County payment. And so I like this spreadsheet. It calculates the possible payments, but also tells you how close am I getting an Ark County payment. And so very useful tool. Only a few numbers need to be input in order to make this comparison.
And then you can also use it to do the PLC yield
Yeah, the yield
updating.
date's very quick. I mean, obviously you're doing this by FSA farm, by crop. But the calculation is very simple with this tool. You put in your current PLC yield, put in your farm yields, and then it tells you directly on whether it would benefit you to update or not. That's the bottom line. Updating will result in a higher PLC yield. You'll get a different message there if updating does not look attractive. Now this is a little bit of an unusual case, perhaps, Jim. I've got all 5 years have yield data here for this farm. There's a lot of FSA farms where you're doing corn one year, soybeans the next. You put in the yield information you have, and it does the calculations based on that. And so if I had corn in 2013, 2015, and 2017, 14 and 16 would be left blank, and I'd do the computations and using that data to see whether it pays to update or not.
That's an interesting point. Kaitlin, you might explain how that works. So as Michael indicated, a lot of us on an FSA farm might be just flipping it from corn and soybeans one year to the next. Let's say I've got a situation where over that 5-year span on the screen, I only had 3 years of corn data. How does the computation actually work in terms of computing that updated yield?
So for the calculation, we would then only take the simple average of those 3 years. We only take the years that were actually planted to that crop for the yield update calculation.
Okay, good.
And that's why sometimes it doesn't pay to update, because on this farm, if I had corn in 13, 15, and 17, 15 was really not very good. That was a very wet June, if you remember that, and so the yield was really low. That makes it much less likely that you're going to update. We did in this case, but there's going to be instances where that low yield is going to pull that computation down, and it's not going to pay to update. And so the years really do matter.
Yeah. Good point.
Maybe an obvious point. We don't have a screenshot of it, Jim, but I'm going to talk about it anyway. There is also sheets you can use to look at the ARC individual, one farm at a time, and that I strongly encourage people to use the tool to look at this. It's complicated enough. Don't do these calculations by hand. Put in your corn data, your soybean data, and put in some of your other requested data. But that's the main data you need to put in is your farm yields, and let the tool help you make that choice.
Yeah, good point. All right, so we mentioned that you can get the details on our website, so you can download a copy of the slides that we presented today. Those will be available later today on our website. You'll also have an opportunity to view this webinar again. I think that'll probably be available tomorrow. And then you can download the spreadsheet that we just mentioned, all of them available at our Purdue Center for Commercial Agriculture website at purdue.edu, Commercial Ag. That's the home page, and it'll be prominent on there in terms of where to go, so it'll be under the fairly prominent button on the front page of the slide. So with that, let's see, I think we've got a couple of upcoming regional Farm Bill conferences coming up, some in-person appearances on February 5. The three of us will be down at Vincennes. On February 12, we'll be in Huntington, Indiana, and you can register to attend either one of those conferences or both of them if you so desire at our website, and again, that'll be fairly prominent. So that'll be a chance maybe to review some of this information if you're watching the webinar, and maybe if you got some in-person questions you want to ask, that'd be a good chance to attend one of those. So with that, I'm going to go to the computer here, and we do have a few questions. So I think the first one's probably for Kaitlin. Does POA, I assume they mean power of attorney, work for landowner signature?
Yes, it does. Yes. So in the case where the landowner updates that PLC yield, if the operator has power of attorney with our office for that landowner, they can sign as POA for that update. Okay,
that was an easy one. Tougher one, Michael. What would be the best program choice for southeastern Indiana farmers as 2019 corn and soybean yields were significantly lower than elsewhere in the state of Indiana?
I think they need to look at that ARC individual, FSA farm by FSA farm, and look for instances where that payment is close to the cap.
Yeah, so there's going to be some situations where the yield drop-off was large enough. Yeah. I should say yield. I should say production drop-off, because I think in Southeast Indiana, again, it would be in some cases a combination of prevented planting and low yields. So look at that first, and then I think if that doesn't work, then our other recommendations still stand.
Yes.
Because as you pointed out, the driver is price, not yield on those other two programs. Yeah. So ARC IC might be a little more applicable for some folks in Southeast Indiana than elsewhere in the state, but in many cases it's probably going to be the same.
I wouldn't call this a sweet spot because that's a misnomer, but that East Central region, I think, is one of the places where this ARC individual is going to be really important, because that's where a significant chunk of prevent plant occurred in Indiana.
East Central and Northeast,
especially. Northeast too. Yeah.
Can we download the slides? Yes, we'll have those available later today, and the presentation is recorded. That recording should be available tomorrow on both on the Center website, and Center maintains a YouTube channel for the Purdue Center for Commercial Agriculture, so both of those locations will have the recorded version. Let's see, the PLC yield update for years 13 to 17. What if I didn't farm it in all of those years? Can I use county yields for years not farmed? How do I get acre history, etc.? So let's maybe kind of collapse that a little bit. A situation where somebody is farming land today in 2020 that they didn't farm during that historical period. How does that work in terms of updating yields? Do they have some options?
Well, if they know who farmed it, they could try to get that information from the past operator or the landowner on that farm. If they know that crop was planted, and we can always verify that with our data, but if they know that it was planted to that crop but don't have the yield data available, each county has a substitute yield that can be used in those cases.
If you, is there a possibility, if you are reasonably confident that it was insured, that you can obtain the RMA yields even though you were not the person that purchased the crop insurance, or do we know the answer to that?
I would say that you would have to discuss that with the operator if you knew the operator at that time.
Or the landowner.
Or the landowner.
Yeah, okay. Since March 15 falls on a Sunday, I hadn't checked that. Is the deadline really March 13 or is it March 16?
It's March 16th. It'll be the Monday.
Okay.
Yes.
Kind of like the
Good question.
Yeah, it's kind of like taxes.
Kind of like the IRS, right? So it's the day after. So okay, so maybe we should. Well, anyway, would the Ark County program be a better option for counties where the 2019 county average yield is 30% lower than in previous years? I'll repeat that question while you think about it. Would the Ark County program be a better option for counties where the 2019 county average yield is 30% lower than previous years?
It's likely to be a more competitive option here. We're talking about corn. It's something definitely they want to look at, and you know, I haven't done that scenario specifically, but my guess is our county's going to look pretty good in that situation for 19.
So that was a good question. I have a feeling when we get back to the office, we will be running that scenario.
That. Yeah, you know, that sizable a loss, you're probably looking at an Ark County payment.
Okay, yeah, so we'll take a closer look at that. Why are they only using a simple average and not a weighted average for yields? And I assume by weight they want to do acreage.
That's how the policy is written.
And the answer is that's the way the bill was written in Washington.
Yeah.
Okay. So we'll push that off on our legislators. What is the link for those calculation tools? We've had that on the website, so purdue.edu/commercial ag, and you can download that. That's actually up right now. I always participate in the FSA commodity programs, but do not carry crop insurance. So how does that affect my sign up for 2019 and 2020?
As far as updating the yield?
Probably.
Well, the yield update is a certification. So we are not asking for any production evidence up front when the producer wants to update their yield. But do keep in mind that there will be a spot check process where maybe later, if that producer was selected to be spot checked, we would ask for production evidence to support those yields.
Yeah, and the reason we mentioned RMA is because if you do carry crop insurance, you've already been turning those in, and it makes it pretty easy. Mm-hmm. If you haven't been doing that, it might be easy if you've been keeping good records.
Yeah.
If you're not keeping real good records, maybe not so easy. That's kind of how I'd put that. It says, will the links to the calculation tool be available? When will the links be available? They are on the website now, but I will, before we go off the air, I will maybe highlight a little more clearly how you can get those from our website. How will the new bill treat organic farmers? Everybody's looking at their shoes. I'm not sure exactly what they're asking there. Let me think about this. I mean, I guess what they're getting at is lower yields.
Yeah.
Because of organic production practices. Is there anything specific with respect to organic production practices? We've got...
That's some homework we're going to have to do.
Yeah, that's some homework.
Yeah, because I think what prompted the question is the fact that we've got irrigated yields, non-irrigated yields, but we don't actually have any provision for organic production practice yields.
And there is crop insurance for organic in a lot of situations, and so I think that's why that's coming up. But we're going to have to do homework on that.
Yeah, that's a great question. That's one we hadn't heard before. How do we obtain base acres and PLC yields for farm numbers from our FSA office? Is there a form we can ask for?
Yeah, you can request your farm data, and the office will know which form to give you. It'll have your crop base acres, your farm number. If you're a landowner requesting it, it'll have your operator's name and your current PLC yield.
And I think this is true. If you are set up to do things electronically, you can access that information electronically, correct?
Right, I believe so.
Let's see. We had another question about the organic farmers, so we need to do some homework on that. For PLC, how is the effective price established? Again, that was legislative, right? So that $3.70 for corn, $8.40 for soybeans, and
$5.50 for wheat
was written in the legislation.
That was actually the same price as used in the 14.
Yeah. Who makes program election if you have different operators in 2019 versus 2020? That's a good question. We got this the other day.
Yeah. So because the election is effective for the 2 years, the 2019 producer will make the election for 19 and 20. So if you're a new producer in 2020, the prior operator is making that election decision for both years.
So I'm going to guess somebody will ask this question. What if maybe the reason I'm farming this in 2020 is because the previous operator is deceased? How does that work? You know, just envision a situation where the previous operator is no longer around.
We have provisions for those cases. The personal representative of the deceased can sign the 2019 election contract, or if they have an estate set up, their executor of their estate can sign the 19 contract and make that election.
Okay.
Yeah.
A landowner that had very few acres and 100% prevent plant, what would you recommend? Michael, I think that's a situation where the ARC-IC is going to be very attractive for that particular FSA farm number. And let's see. White and Whitley counties are the only counties that show up when trying to choose counties. Where are the other 90 counties at? In that drop-down menu, it should. They're all in there. So the way the process works is you pick off your state and kind of go through. I will say this: that spreadsheet works best on a PC, not on a Macintosh. And I say that because I'm a Mac user. I wouldn't say it doesn't work on a Mac, but it definitely does not work as well on a Mac.
But there's a button that scrolls up and down, but all the counties are there.
Yeah, they're all there. It does work, but I would say, in my personal experience with both PCs and Macs, it does seem to work better on a PC. Yeah, and it looks like the person that was looking for the tool found it, but I'll guess what I'll say is when I get back to the office, we'll try and make sure the tool is really obvious on that front page of the website. It is available there.
And the examples we were talking about are currently in the tool, so you want to change those for your situation.
Yeah, Michael's numbers are in the tool at the moment. So with that, I think we'll wrap it up. And if you do have some questions, you can obviously email one of us at Purdue. My email address is just jmintert@purdue.edu, and Michael's is more complicated.
Yes, mlangme@purdue.edu.
And we'd be happy to try and address your questions by way of email. And I would highlight that we'll again have the slides out there a little bit later today. We'll have a recorded version available tomorrow. And then, of course, we've got the 2 in-person programs coming up on February 5 and February 12. And if you haven't made that appointment at your FSA office, I would encourage you to make that phone call today.
Yes.
Today or tomorrow. We'll give people a couple of days, but get that done and get started on the process. So with that, thanks to our panelists, thanks to Kaitlin and Michael for joining us today, and on behalf of the Purdue Center for Commercial Agriculture, I'm Jim Mintert.